There is something profoundly important about the first moments of the day, and most people underestimate just how much those moments matter. We tend to think that our lives are shaped by major decisions, dramatic events, or significant turning points. And certainly, those things have their place. But if you look carefully at how human beings actually function, you'll notice something different. Our lives are often shaped by small, repeated actions that occur so regularly we barely notice them. The first 10 minutes after you wake up are among the most influential minutes of your entire day. Why? Because when you wake up, you are not simply restarting a biological machine, you are re-entering consciousness. Every morning, in a sense, you are stepping back into the world. You are reorienting yourself toward reality. You are deciding, consciously or unconsciously, what matters, what deserves your attention, and what will occupy the center of your mind. Most people don't make that decision intentionally. Instead, they reach for their phone. Within seconds, their attention is captured by notifications, headlines, messages, opinions, arguments, advertisements, and endless streams of information. Before they have even fully awakened, they have surrendered control of their consciousness to whatever happens to be demanding attention that morning. Now think about what that means psychologically. Attention is not a trivial thing. Attention is the mechanism through which you organize reality itself. What you pay attention to becomes your world. If your first act each morning is to immerse yourself in chaos, urgency, and distraction, you are effectively training your mind to believe that chaos, urgency, and distraction are the most important realities in your life. And then people wonder why they feel anxious. They wonder why they feel scattered. They wonder why they struggle to focus on what truly matters. But the answer is often hidden in the structure of their daily habits. The beginning of the day is a threshold. It is a transition point between sleep and responsibility, between potential and action. Ancient religious traditions understood this deeply. Across centuries and cultures, people recognized that the opening moments of the day carry symbolic and practical significance. Before engaging with the demands of the world, they would first orient themselves toward what was highest. That is what giving God the first 10 minutes is really about. It is not merely a religious ritual. It is an act of orientation. You are saying, before I confront my problems, I will remember the source of wisdom. Before I pursue my goals, I will remember the purpose behind them. Before I allow the world to tell me who I am, I will remind myself whose I am. That changes something fundamental, because every day presents a battle for your attention. There are countless forces competing to determine what you think about, what you value, and what you pursue. If you do not consciously establish your priorities, those priorities will be established for you, and that rarely ends well. A person who begins the day with prayer, reflection, gratitude, or scripture is doing something psychologically remarkable. They are creating order before confronting complexity. They are establishing a hierarchy of values before entering a world filled with competing demands. In many ways, this mirrors one of the deepest truths about human flourishing. Order must precede effective action. Imagine trying to build a house without a blueprint. Imagine setting out on a journey without knowing your destination. Imagine attempting to solve a problem without understanding the principles involved. You would wander aimlessly. Yet many people do exactly that with their lives every single morning. They launch themselves into activity before establishing direction. Giving God the first 10 minutes interrupts that pattern. It creates a pause, a sacred pause. A moment in which you step back and recognize that your life is not merely a collection of tasks to complete. It is a responsibility entrusted to you. It is a calling. It is a journey with moral, spiritual, and eternal dimensions. When you begin the day from that perspective, even ordinary activities start to change. Work becomes more meaningful. Challenges become more manageable. Relationships become more important. Difficulties become opportunities for growth rather than merely obstacles to overcome. And perhaps most importantly, you begin the day with humility. You acknowledge that you do not possess all wisdom. You acknowledge that your perspective is limited. You acknowledge that guidance is needed, that recognition is not weakness. It is the foundation of genuine strength, because the strongest people are not those who assume they have all the answers. The strongest people are those who continually orient themselves toward truth. That is why the first 10 minutes matter so much. They are not simply 10 minutes. They are a declaration of priority. They are a statement about what sits at the center of your life. And when God occupies that center, everything else has a better chance of finding its proper place. The way you begin your day reveals what you truly believe matters most. Give God the first 10 minutes, and you may discover that those 10 minutes begin transforming the other 20, 3 hours and 50 minutes that follow. Once you've established the importance of giving God the first moments of your day, another question naturally emerges. What actually happens during those moments? Why do they matter so much? Why can 10 minutes spent with God have a greater impact than an hour spent consuming information, planning, or worrying? The answer has to do with something that modern life desperately lacks: clarity. One of the defining characteristics of our age is not ignorance. In fact, we are surrounded by more information than any generation in human history. We have access to endless knowledge, endless opinions, endless advice. At any moment, we can learn about events happening on the other side of the world. We can access thousands of books, lectures, articles, and videos within seconds. Yet, despite all of that information, many people feel more confused than ever. Why? Because information and wisdom are not the same thing. Information tells you what is happening. Wisdom helps you understand what matters. And without a clear sense of what matters, human beings become fragmented. Their attention gets pulled in 100 different directions. They spend enormous amounts of energy reacting to circumstances rather than responding thoughtfully to them. This is where a daily appointment with God becomes so powerful. When you dedicate the first 10 minutes of your day to prayer, gratitude, worship, and reflection, you are doing something far deeper than performing a religious exercise. You are intentionally stepping out of the noise and into a space where your priorities can be reordered. Think about how rare that is. Most people wake up and immediately enter reaction mode. They react to emails. They react to social media. They react to obligations. They react to unexpected problems. Before long, the entire day becomes a sequence of responses to external demands. But a person who begins with God starts somewhere different. Instead of asking, "What is demanding my attention today?" they begin by asking, "What is truly important today?" Those are radically different questions. The first question is driven by urgency. The second is driven by meaning. And human beings do not thrive on urgency alone. We thrive on meaning. Psychologically speaking, meaning functions as a stabilizing force. It helps us endure uncertainty, navigate suffering, and maintain direction when circumstances become difficult. Without meaning, even small challenges can feel overwhelming. With meaning, people can endure remarkable hardship and still move forward. That is one reason prayer matters. Prayer is not simply about asking for things. At its deepest level, prayer is an act of alignment. It is the process of bringing your concerns, fears, ambitions, and desires into conversation with something greater than yourself. When you pray, you are forced to articulate what actually matters. You examine your motives. You confront your worries. You acknowledge your limitations. You recognize that not everything is under your control. And strangely enough, that realization often produces peace rather than anxiety, because much of our stress comes from trying to carry burdens we were never meant to carry. People spend enormous amounts of mental energy attempting to control outcomes, predict the future, and eliminate uncertainty. Yet life stubbornly refuses to cooperate with those efforts. Reality remains unpredictable. Prayer reminds us that while we are responsible for our actions, we are not sovereign over existence itself. There is freedom in that recognition. There is peace in understanding that your responsibility is to act faithfully, not to control every possible outcome. Gratitude works in a similar way. Consider how easily the human mind gravitates toward problems. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. Our ancestors survived by paying attention to threats. The brain developed a natural tendency to scan for danger, identify weaknesses, and anticipate problems. That ability has obvious advantages, but it also creates a problem. If left unchecked, the mind can become so focused on what is wrong that it loses sight of what is right. Gratitude interrupts that pattern. It shifts attention toward blessings that are often overlooked. It reminds us that despite our difficulties, there are gifts woven throughout our lives, relationships, opportunities, lessons, provisions, moments of beauty, and evidence of grace. And what you focus on expands in your awareness. This doesn't mean ignoring suffering or pretending problems don't exist. It means refusing to allow problems to become the entire story. Then there is reflection. Reflection is one of the most underrated disciplines in modern culture. We live in a world that celebrates constant activity, but activity without reflection often produces chaos. Reflection creates perspective. It allows you to step back from the immediate pressures of life and examine them within a larger framework. You begin asking questions that are easy to ignore during the rush of daily existence. Who am I becoming? What kind of person am I today? Are my actions aligned with my values? Am I moving toward wisdom or merely staying busy? Those questions matter because character is not built accidentally. It is formed through repeated choices examined honestly over time. And that is exactly what these first 10 minutes provide. They create a sacred space in which clarity can emerge. A space where peace can replace panic. A space where eternal truths can challenge temporary anxieties. A space where God's perspective can begin to reshape your own. The world will spend the rest of the day trying to tell you what deserves your attention. Those first 10 minutes allow you to hear a different voice, a voice that reminds you who you are, why you are here, and what ultimately matters. And when clarity arrives, peace often follows, because a mind anchored in God is far less likely to be swept away by the storms of the day. Spend 10 minutes with the one who sees the whole picture, and you'll stop being ruled by every piece of it. At this point, a reasonable objection often arises. Someone hears the challenge to give God the first 10 minutes of the day and thinks, can 10 minutes really make that much difference? After all, 10 minutes seems insignificant. It is a tiny fraction of a 24-hour day. It can feel almost too simple to matter. But that question reveals something interesting about how we tend to misunderstand transformation. Human beings are often fascinated by dramatic change. We admire stories of sudden breakthroughs, life-altering experiences, and extraordinary moments that appear to transform everything overnight. And those moments do occur. There are times when a single decision, a single conversation, or a single event changes the trajectory of a person's life. But if you examine most meaningful growth carefully, you'll discover that it rarely happens all at once. More often, transformation occurs through accumulation. Small actions repeated consistently over long periods of time create outcomes that appear extraordinary when viewed from a distance. A tree does not become enormous in a day. A marriage is not strengthened through one grand gesture. Wisdom is not acquired in a single afternoon. Character is not formed in a moment of inspiration. These things develop gradually, often so gradually that the change is almost invisible while it is happening. Yet over time, the results become undeniable. This principle is deeply embedded in reality itself. Small causes, consistently applied, generate remarkable effects. In psychology, in education, in health, in relationships, and in spiritual life, consistency almost always outperforms intensity. And that is why giving God the first 10 minutes of every day is so powerful. Its strength lies not in its size, but in its repetition. Many people approach their spiritual lives the same way they approach New Year's resolutions. They rely on emotional surges. They wait until they feel inspired. They seek extraordinary experiences that will somehow sustain them indefinitely. But emotion is unstable, motivation fluctuates, enthusiasm rises and falls. If your spiritual life depends entirely on how you feel, it will become vulnerable to every change in circumstance. There will be days when you feel close to God. There will be days when you feel distant. There will be days when prayer feels natural. There will be days when it feels difficult. The question is not whether those fluctuations exist. They do. The real question is what remains when the emotions disappear, and the answer is habit. Habit is one of the most powerful forces in human existence. What you repeatedly do becomes part of who you are. The actions you perform consistently begin shaping your identity. They influence your perceptions, your priorities, your beliefs, and eventually your character. This is why daily spiritual practices matter so much. Every morning you choose to spend 10 minutes with God. You are reinforcing a fundamental truth. God is not an occasional priority. He is the foundation. That decision, repeated day after day, begins to alter the structure of your life. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily, and steady growth is often the most reliable kind. One of the great mistakes people make is underestimating the power of seemingly insignificant actions. We tend to dismiss small choices because their immediate consequences appear minimal. Missing one workout doesn't seem important. Skipping one conversation doesn't seem important. Ignoring one opportunity doesn't seem important. Likewise, neglecting 10 minutes with God may not appear significant in the moment. But life is rarely determined by isolated events. Life is shaped by patterns, and patterns are created through repetition. What you repeatedly prioritize reveals what you truly value. If God consistently receives your first attention, your heart begins to align itself accordingly. Over time, something remarkable happens. Your thinking changes, your responses change, your desires change. Your perspective changes, not because you forced yourself into transformation, but because you placed yourself repeatedly in the presence of the one who transforms. There is a profound lesson here about spiritual maturity. Many people want the fruit of spiritual growth without accepting the process that produces it. They want peace without prayer, wisdom without reflection, faith without discipline, strength without practice. But reality does not work that way. Every meaningful achievement requires sustained effort directed toward a worthy goal. Spiritual growth is no exception. In fact, the biblical vision of discipleship consistently emphasizes faithfulness over spectacle. The emphasis is not on occasional greatness, but on daily obedience, not on rare moments of inspiration, but on repeated acts of devotion. This perspective is deeply liberating because it means you do not need to accomplish something extraordinary every morning. You do not need to have a profound revelation every day. You do not need to feel spiritually overwhelmed by emotion. You simply need to show up again and again, day after day, morning after morning, because each time you do, you are casting a vote for the person you are becoming. Each prayer strengthens the habit of dependence on God. Each moment of gratitude strengthens the habit of appreciation. Each act of reflection strengthens the habit of wisdom. Each morning of faithfulness strengthens the habit of seeking what is highest before pursuing everything else. And habits over time become character. Character becomes destiny. This is why the first 10 minutes matter so much. Not because they are magical, not because they instantly solve every problem, but because they represent a daily investment in the kind of person you are becoming. The miracle is not found in one morning. The miracle is found in thousands of mornings. It is found in the quiet accumulation of faithful choices that gradually reshape an entire life. And years later, when people look at the peace, wisdom, strength, and spiritual maturity that have emerged, they may call it extraordinary. But you will know where it began. It began with 10 minutes, because a life transformed by God is usually built the same way a cathedral is built, one faithful stone at a time. As we continue exploring why those first 10 minutes matter, we arrive at something that many people find both intriguing and challenging: the idea that God speaks. Now, the moment that phrase is used, different reactions emerge. Some people immediately think of dramatic experiences, supernatural visions, or extraordinary revelations. Others become skeptical because they have never experienced anything that seemed unmistakably divine. But regardless of where someone falls on that spectrum, it is worth examining a deeper truth that lies beneath the discussion. One of the greatest obstacles to hearing anything meaningful is noise, and modern life is saturated with it. We live in an age of constant stimulation. Information arrives endlessly. Notifications compete for our attention. Entertainment is available every waking moment. Opinions flood our minds from every direction. Many people move from one distraction to another without ever experiencing genuine silence. The consequence of this is not merely busyness, it is fragmentation. When your attention is constantly divided, your capacity for deep perception begins to weaken. You become skilled at consuming information but less capable of discerning wisdom. You hear many voices but struggle to recognize which ones deserve your trust. This matters because some truths can only be perceived in stillness. Consider how human relationships work. The most meaningful conversations are rarely the loudest. The deepest insights often emerge during moments of reflection rather than moments of chaos. Important realizations frequently arrive when external distractions finally diminish. There is a psychological reality here that is difficult to ignore. When the mind is overwhelmed by noise, subtle signals become impossible to detect, and much of God's guidance operates through those subtle signals. Not because God lacks power, not because he is incapable of speaking clearly, but because genuine transformation often requires participation. It requires attention, it requires willingness, it requires the humility to listen. This is one reason the first 10 minutes of the day are so significant. Before the demands of life begin competing for your attention, there is an opportunity to become still, to sit quietly, to pray, to reflect, to read Scripture, to create space for something deeper than reaction and impulse. And in that space, something remarkable can happen. You begin noticing things you would otherwise miss. Perhaps it is a conviction about an attitude that needs correction. Perhaps it is clarity about a decision you've been avoiding. Perhaps it is a reminder of a truth you've neglected. Perhaps it is encouragement during a season of uncertainty. Perhaps it is a sense of direction that gradually emerges as you reflect on God's Word. These experiences are often far less dramatic than people expect. Yet they can be profoundly life-changing. One of the reasons many people miss this daily miracle is that they are looking for thunder while ignoring whispers. They expect God to communicate through extraordinary events while overlooking the countless ways wisdom quietly enters consciousness. Think about some of the most important decisions in your life. Many of them were not made because of sudden emotional excitement. They emerged through gradual understanding. You reflected, you considered, you wrestled with competing possibilities. And eventually clarity appeared. That process itself reveals something important. Human beings often encounter truth incrementally. The same principle applies spiritually. God's guidance frequently unfolds through consistent engagement rather than isolated experiences. This is why Scripture repeatedly emphasizes listening. Listening is not passive. Listening is active attention. It is the disciplined choice to focus on something beyond your immediate desires, fears, and assumptions. And that discipline is increasingly rare. Most people spend their lives speaking internally. Their minds are filled with endless commentary, endless concerns, endless interpretations of events. They rarely pause long enough to examine those thoughts, much less challenge them. Yet wisdom often begins when that internal noise quiets. In those moments, you may discover that not every fear deserves your trust. Not every desire deserves your obedience. Not every assumption reflects reality. You begin to separate what is true from what is merely urgent. And that distinction can alter the course of a life. Philosophically speaking, there is another dimension worth considering. Every human being serves something. Whether consciously or unconsciously, everyone organizes their life around a highest value. For some, it is status. For others, wealth, pleasure, power, achievement, or social approval. Whatever occupies the highest position in your hierarchy of values eventually shapes your decisions. The question is not whether you have a guiding voice. The question is which voice is guiding you. When you spend the first 10 minutes of your day seeking God, you are intentionally placing yourself under the influence of a different source of authority. You are saying that truth matters more than convenience, that wisdom matters more than impulse, that purpose matters more than comfort, that eternal realities deserve greater attention than temporary distractions. And over time, this repeated act of listening begins reshaping the way you perceive the world. You become more attentive, more discerning, more thoughtful, more capable of recognizing what truly matters. The irony is that many people spend years searching for direction while avoiding the very silence in which direction often appears. They seek answers without creating space for reflection. They seek wisdom without cultivating stillness. They seek God's voice while surrounding themselves with competing voices from the moment they wake up until the moment they fall asleep. But wisdom has always required attention, and attention requires space. That is why these first 10 minutes are not merely a routine. They are an invitation to step away from noise, an invitation to listen before speaking, an invitation to seek understanding before action, an invitation to encounter God's perspective before being overwhelmed by the world's demands. Because some of the most important words you will ever hear are not shouted over the noise of life. They are discovered in the quiet moments when you finally become still enough to listen. And often the difference between confusion and clarity is simply the willingness to hear what has been there all along. As we bring this discussion toward its conclusion, it is important to understand something that sits at the center of everything we've explored. Giving God the first 10 minutes of your day is not ultimately about improving your mornings. It is about transforming your life. Now, that may sound like an exaggerated claim. After all, how could 10 minutes possibly influence something as vast and complex as an entire life? Yet, if we've learned anything from psychology, philosophy, and spiritual tradition, it is that small practices often have consequences far beyond their apparent size. The reason is simple. Human beings do not live merely through isolated moments. We live through patterns. What you repeatedly think becomes the framework through which you interpret reality. What you repeatedly value becomes the standard by which you make decisions. What you repeatedly practice becomes part of your character, and character, more than talent, intelligence, opportunity, or circumstance, often determines the trajectory of a life. This means that when you consistently place God first each morning, something deeper is occurring than the completion of a spiritual routine. You are establishing an organizing principle for your existence. You are deciding what belongs at the center. And that matters because every life revolves around a center. Every person has a highest priority, whether they recognize it or not. For some, it is achievement. For others, wealth. For others, comfort. For others, social approval. These priorities become the lens through which they interpret success and failure, meaning and suffering, purpose and identity. The problem is that anything finite eventually proves insufficient as the foundation of a human life. Achievement can disappear, money can be lost, reputation can be damaged, comfort can vanish overnight. Even the things we treasure most remain vulnerable to change. This is why so many people experience instability when circumstances shift. Their sense of identity has become attached to things that cannot ultimately sustain it. But when God occupies the center, something different happens. Your identity becomes anchored in something greater than success or failure. Your value becomes independent of temporary outcomes. Your purpose becomes larger than immediate circumstances, and that creates a remarkable degree of resilience. Consider how this affects your relationships. A person who begins each day by orienting themselves toward God is more likely to approach others with patience rather than irritation, more likely to seek understanding rather than domination, more likely to forgive, more likely to show compassion. Not because they are perfect, but because they have spent time reminding themselves of truths larger than their emotions. Many relational conflicts emerge because people react impulsively. They speak before reflecting. They judge before understanding. They defend themselves before examining their own shortcomings. But the individual who starts the day grounded in prayer and reflection carries a different spirit into those interactions. The morning influences the afternoon influences the evening, the day influences the week influences the year, and eventually those patterns influence an entire lifetime. The same principle applies to decision making. Life is filled with choices, many of which seem insignificant at the time they are made, yet small decisions accumulate. A choice made in anger can damage a relationship. A choice made in fear can limit opportunity. A choice made in pride can create years of unnecessary suffering. The quality of our decisions depends largely on the quality of our perspective, and perspective is precisely what those first 10 minutes help cultivate. When you begin with God, you enter the day less likely to be controlled by immediate impulses and more likely to act according to enduring principles. That does not mean every decision becomes easy. It means your decisions become anchored in something deeper than convenience. There is also a profound effect on suffering. Every life contains hardship. No amount of planning, intelligence, or effort can eliminate that reality. Disappointment will come, loss will come, uncertainty will come, moments of confusion and pain will arrive for every person. The question is not whether suffering exists. The question is whether suffering destroys your sense of meaning. People can endure extraordinary difficulties when they believe those difficulties exist within a meaningful framework. Without meaning, suffering becomes unbearable. With meaning, suffering can become transformative. This is one reason faith has sustained human beings throughout history. Faith does not remove every challenge. It changes the way challenges are interpreted. The person who consistently places God first learns to view difficulties differently. Obstacles become opportunities for growth. Delays become opportunities for patience. Failures become opportunities for humility and learning. The circumstances themselves may remain difficult, but their meaning changes. And when meaning changes, everything changes. This is the daily miracle that so many people miss. They imagine miracles as dramatic interruptions of natural events. Yet one of the greatest miracles is far quieter. It is the gradual transformation of a human being. It is the slow reshaping of thoughts, attitudes, priorities, and actions. It is the process through which fear becomes faith. Chaos becomes order, confusion becomes wisdom, self-centeredness becomes service. That transformation rarely announces itself. It happens quietly, morning by morning, prayer by prayer, choice by choice, 10 minutes at a time. And then one day, perhaps years later, you realize that you are no longer the person you once were. Your relationships are healthier. Your perspective is clearer. Your faith is stronger. Your character is deeper. Your life possesses a stability that cannot be explained by circumstances alone. And when that moment arrives, you may discover that the greatest impact of giving God the first 10 minutes was never what happened during those 10 minutes themselves. It was what happened to everything that followed. Because when you give God the first part of your day, you are not simply changing your schedule. You are allowing Him to change the person who lives it. The first 10 minutes may seem small, but a life surrendered to God is built exactly that way. One morning, one choice, and one faithful step at a time.